Perfect. So thanks everyone for attending. Yeah, as Leon mentioned, so today we're going to be talking about combining AI and brain modeling. Um, this is still, I would say, a pretty new area of research in general. And AI, or in this case, more specifically, what we'll talk about is machine learning, which is a subset of AI. I would say has more traditionally been used in related fields like brain-computer interfacing, which is what part of what my background is, and in other areas of medicine. And more, it's starting to be applied in conjunction with brain modeling. So we'll talk a little bit about how that works and what the applications are. And with these kinds of talks, I suppose we always have a big mixture in the audience of people who come from an AI background or a machine learning background or more of a clinical background or a biology background. So there's always going to be a, a wide range of levels of expertise in this topic. So just to talk about what the goals for this session are, um, we will start pretty simple. We're going to assume very little background knowledge on machine learning in general, but we will assume that you have some basic conceptual and maybe mathematical understanding of statistics at least. So for this session, what we want to do is to acquire a conceptual understanding of basic machine learning. And we'll focus a lot more on classification because in general, a much broader array of applications involve classification, and a lot of papers you will read involve classification more specifically. Uh, and we'll talk, again, of course, much more about what classification actually is. Um, Second, we will understand how to construct a valid classification pipeline and why each piece of it is important for validity and robustness. So this would be a little bit more geared towards first having the literacy to understand a paper that um, involves classification and machine learning in general, to understand how much confidence you can have in the results based on the pipeline that they and the methodology that they employ. And also for those of you who want to actually experiment with designing your own machine learning based experiments or using something like TVB or brain modeling in general to perform these kinds of experiments yourself. And finally, we'll talk about some applications of machine learning with TVB. So with that in mind, there's a basic outline for the day. We start with the basic machine learning concepts. Talk more specifically about what classification is and how to design a valid experiment. We'll go through some application for brain modeling, and then if there's time, we'll go through a coding demo. And in case we run out of time a little bit early, then the code demo will at least be available to you. So let's find out about what machine learning is and some of the basics. Um, just because there's a lot of hype in general about machine learning, and I think a lot of confusion about what machine learning and AI actually is, I think it's very useful to think of machine learning as a special kind of statistical method. And in particular, it's geared towards predictive pattern recognition. So it's closely related to inferential statistics, but in particular, it has a little bit more flexibility in how it can be applied. And we're especially looking at methods that allow us to make predictions about new data. So something that's maybe a bit interesting about machine learning is that, like a lot of inferential statistics methods, we're fitting weights in some kind of function to solve a problem, often a classification problem or a regression problem. But in the case of machine learning, we might not actually be able to know or understand or write the function that's being solved for. So whereas with statistics in general, you might have, in the case of linear methods, a essentially a linear equation, so for example, a linear regression line or even a nonlinear equation, but we would have the mathematical form of that equation, and then we would understand how the coefficients interact with that equation in order to construct our regression line or curve or what have you. But in the case of machine learning, because of the degree of flexibility it has, it can solve often much more complicated problems, but we might not understand mathematically what that solution actually is. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that sense. And this is what's referred to as the black box problem, as many of you have probably heard about. So when we talk about machine learning, there are kind of different layers of subdivision that we can consider. So I suppose you guys can see my cursor. I hope so, at least. Unsupervised learning and supervised learning is kind of the first split that we have when we talk about machine learning. So very broadly, the division here is about whether we have labels for our data. So the formulation of a machine learning data set often involves a set of variables that we call features along a set of samples. And this is, of course, is identical to what you would have in any kind of statistical problem. So you'd have gender, weight, age for a set of n people. And in unsupervised learning, we might take that data set and do some kind of data analysis on the basis of just that data set alone. Whereas in supervised learning, one of those variables or an additional set of variables is going to be used as a set of labels. And those labels are sort of a target, so our output variable space. So this might be familiar when we're talking about regression. We usually have a set of X variables that we consider our input space. And what we're trying to predict is the relationship between those X variables and some target variable Y, which is our output space. And so that can be, I don't know, something like the diet and exercise, features about the diet and exercise of several individuals. And the target variable might be the ratio of lean body mass to non-lean body mass in those individuals. In the case of clustering, we don't have that target output space, but what we're trying to look at is whether there are naturally occurring divisions or clusters in the data. So this might be, for example, in Bayesian methods, distribution fitting techniques that can show that, for example, this distribution of data is multimodal rather than unimodal, and the modes of those distributions serve as different clusters, essentially. So what we're looking at in general are three fundamental forms of pattern recognition, and pretty much all applications of machine learning can be categorized as some combination of these three types of pattern recognition. I mentioned before, of course, already classification. So just to get a little bit more specific now, when we're talking about classification, we have our input space. So this would be sort of our X and Y axis here, is whatever variables these are. We can plot our data along these two input variables. And our Y variable or target variable, which are our labels, are represented by the different types of points. So these X's versus these circles. And the problem of classification is to find a decision boundary that separates as optimally as possible the labels in our data. Regression. I think most of you are quite familiar with regression. You have, of course, your cluster of data. And what we're interested in is the relationship between our input space and the target variable, whatever that is. And in general, we're trying to draw a line or a curve that minimizes the mean squared error between the totality of the points, or the data points, and the model that describes this relationship itself. And clustering, like I mentioned, is trying to understand whether we can discover, in fact, that there are different, perhaps, categories within the data that are not labeled. So we're going to, like I said, talk about classification in particular. Now that we've covered sort of the very basic concepts that should give you some at least a good starting point for the literacy in machine learning papers. Um, we can talk about a little bit more specifically how classification works and how to design a valid experiment. And the first step in that, which is very important, is what kind of data do we actually need to make this work? Um, so data quality is actually one of the most important factors when we're talking about making a machine learning experiment successful. Um, the old adage, which probably many of you are familiar with from your statistics lectures at some point, um, that is garbage in, garbage out. I would say maybe maybe even applies even more strongly in the machine learning context, just because machine learning has the propensity to be so good at fitting data and for pattern recognition, um, that you can really fall into this false positive kind of situation where it looks like it's discovered some very meaningful patterns, but because the data are just garbage essentially, or just very noisy, it's very powerfully able to fit to noise. So you have to be very, very careful about data quality. And in particular, machine learning results can be extremely sensitive in both overfitting and underfitting sense to the quality of data. So we talk a lot about big data in machine learning, and in sometimes it feels like we are maybe underrepresenting the importance of good data. So there's a lot of literature about what data quality actually means and how to define it. I would just say some important considerations are first whether your data are actually representative of the problem or um, of the input space you're trying to analyze. So this might mean, for example, that if you want to, let's say, diagnose Alzheimer's, um, it might not be very helpful to have data about, I don't know, let's say the limb lengths of each limb for a bunch of people. This isn't really representative of the problem that we're trying to solve. We might be more interested in um, something to do with the brain, something to do with diet, blood markers, and things like that that we know are somehow related to Alzheimer's disease. So essentially, um, do the data that we have actually carry information about the problem that we're trying to solve in the first place? Always an important consideration, and in general, it's a big reason why machine learning experts need to collaborate and work closely with domain experts. The accuracy of the data is always an issue, especially with, well, I guess I would say especially with clinical data. Um, there's just so much room for noise and error in data entry, and just uh, variance in terms of or test retest reliability and things like that. So we don't know exactly, or we can't always assume that the data that we have are very precise in general. The cleanliness of the data, of course, noisy data is always going to be an issue. There are statistical techniques to try and clean the data, for example, but in general, if we can get clean data from the source at the data collection stage, that's always going to improve machine learning output. And this, of course, goes back to what I said before, that if you input enough noise into a machine learning model, it very likely would be able to find patterns that spuriously correlate with the data, with the target variables themselves. And then, of course, we're talking about reliability of the data. We don't always know if we were to take these measurements again, would they be similar? Do they actually, uh, can we actually interpret them the way that we think we can interpret them? It's always a big question, right? And in general, we don't always have so much control over this just from the data analysis side, but because we're also a mixture of clinician scientists and domain experts, oftentimes we have some input in how the data are actually collected in the first place. And we need to make these kinds of decisions about how to collect good data as early as possible to make sure that our machine learning experiments can actually go well in the long run. So I mean, in general, when we're talking about machine learning, we're specifically, or more specifically, going to be talking about good modeling because that's the stage at which we can generally intervene. Um, Good models are often characterized most strongly by parsimony. That, of course, means simplicity in the model, means that there's less room for something to go wrong. So you want to be able to solve a problem or fit a function with as few variables and a few degrees of freedom as possible, right? You can, of course, fit a cubic polynomial with 40 features or 40 different degrees of freedom, and you'll always get a very perfect fit that way. Uh, but it doesn't mean that, you know, the data that are used are very representative or reliable, and that it would generalize well to new data. So parsimony is always important, and it's very easy to throw everything you can at a machine learning model and hope that it finds something. But if we can pinpoint specifically just a few features that carry the most information, um, that typically lends you to a more generalizable model. And with parsimony and simplicity, we get better interpretability, which is always very important in machine learning, especially in the clinical setting, because we want to actually understand what drives decisions in machine learning. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we evaluate our machine learning models with statistically sound methods. And this is actually a surprisingly difficult concept to perfect in the machine learning world. And I would say still one of the main reasons that machine learning papers get rejected. So we're going to start working on this topic of what is a statistically sound way to design your machine learning experiment. And we get into this area, this section of pre-processing, which is now how do we actually prepare our feature space or our data so that it can be amenable to pattern recognition. So what do we mean by pre-processing in the machine learning context? I think it's very similar in statistics as well. In a general sense, we can say that this is a series of transformations on the input data that simplifies the classification problem or the machine learning problem more broadly. It applies beyond just classification and is able to reduce some biases. So like in most statistical methods, we would want to do some kind of normalization, look at outliers, um, figure out how we want to deal with missing data, make sure our different variables are scaled appropriately. And that at least gives us a start so that our machine learning model just doesn't go off the rails. So one of the most important things that we would do first in general is just to scale our features. And we'll just talk a little bit about why this is important specifically in the machine learning context. And hopefully this connects to what you might already understand about statistical methods. So it turns out that many machine learning methods, even the very, very complicated ones, at some level and often in multiple places, take advantage of information that's basically encoded in the distance between points. So we can imagine that our feature space or input space is this high dimensional space where we could theoretically plot our different data points. And how close two data points are together tells us something about whether they should belong to the same category. Sometimes this is explicit and sometimes this is very implicit. And how close these points are to a decision boundary, for example, in the case of classification, also tells us something about how important these data points are. So if we had different variables that are scaled differently, this has potentially an undue or unjustified effect on the distance between points, right? So if you had, say, weight that's scaled from 50 to 120 kilograms or something like this. And then you had age, which has already been normalized to from 0 to 1. If we have an algorithm that makes use of Euclidean distances between points, of course, this weight variable will basically dominate um, the model itself. And it could turn out that actually age was the more informative feature and weight is less informative. It's just that we can't really get at that information that's in the age variable because it's just being washed out by this unscaled age variable. It's also the case that when we're talking about gradient descent methods, which are very common and for the convergence of machine learning models, basically unscaled variables make it much more difficult to converge to the proper solution. And you can see this is characterized by basically when you have this more elliptical heat map of the minimum error of the model, you end up having this very noisy path to the solution. And oftentimes you just fail to converge. Whereas once you scale the data, you can actually find this very fast, easy linear path towards the solution. And if we're talking about neural networks, we have the saturation effect problem if we don't scale our data properly, which is basically that the activation function that describes whether a neuron, which represents a feature, would be activated or not to pass on information into the next decision-making layer is very sensitive to large values or large numbers. And so you end up with this saturation effect, which is similar or a loose model of what happens if you have very high stimulation of a biological neuron. And basically the difference between an extremely high, say, temperature and a temperature that's twice as hot as that is meaningless because the neuron is already at its maximal firing rate. So you don't actually see any differentiation of information there. So the same thing happens in artificial neural networks. So here we would use the same scaling methods that you would find in any kind of statistical approach. So min-max scalars, Gaussian scalars, robust scalars they just don't assume Gaussianity. And you can also scale depending on the distributions of your variables, so logarithmic scalars and things like that. So all this is important to get started. Of course, it's very simple to understand why we need to do these things. Now we get into slightly more complicated topics, but not that complicated yet. But the issue of dimensionality reduction in machine learning. This starts to get a little bit more different, or a little more different than what we would see in kind of more traditional statistics. So with dimensionality reduction, we actually have first the problem of overfitting that we want to deal with. And of course, just in case it's not clear, the problem of overfitting is just that you can basically find a solution that seems to work extremely well on your data. So say we're classifying or diagnosing Alzheimer's disease with 95% accuracy, but as soon as we give the model new data that it hasn't seen before, it doesn't really do so well. It's just maybe chance level or a little bit better than a coin flip. So why does that happen? Basically, at least the contribution of the dimensionality of the model is that if we consider any machine learning model with a set of informative features, and we randomly generate features continuously and add it to the model, eventually we'll add enough features that just by chance correlate with the class labels, in this case, the Alzheimer's diagnosis, and the model will perform better and better and better until it reaches some kind of maximal saturation point. That, of course, is not going to be a model that generalizes well to the data because those features only randomly were correlated with the class labels. So those same features randomly will probably not be correlated with the class labels of new data. And then in general, we have so many degrees of freedom to explore that the model would basically miss or not be able to differentiate between models that are actually informative and features that are actually informative and features that aren't. So it might not really adequately make use of truly informative features and just fit based on noise. Um, the other issue when it comes to high dimensionality in our input space is that we end up with a lot of redundancy and irrelevancy in our input variables. So when we have high correlations between features, for example, these features may contain the same information, and then we get overrepresentation of the same information within the model. So if we have basically two different ways of representing age in the model, then we have age. They both might be seen as independently informative because your machine learning model might not differentiate or recognize the fact that these are correlated because they contain the same information. So your model might overemphasize the impact of age and miss out on other important information, or at the very least, overweight the importance of age, and then it fails to generalize to new data again. Of course, sometimes a very important consideration is that this also just increases the computational complexity of the model. And of course, like I mentioned before, parsimony is a feature of a good model, and this is if you have too many features in general, you don't have a parsimonious model. So there are a lot of ways that we can actually deal with dimensionality reduction. Feature selection is kind of the main way in the traditional machine learning world. This is something like using an ANOVA to actually look at which features kind of have a high variance with respect to the class labels you're looking at. You can look at the mutual information between features and the class variables in a training set. And you can even start to combine features to start to deal with the redundancy. So PCA, for example, in the most simplistic case, is a useful tool of taking many correlated features that might contain the same information and reducing it down to a single feature. And this way, you might actually see a drop in overall performance of your model, but at the same time, you could see then better generalization of the model. So in general, we shouldn't be afraid to have a drop in performance. We should prefer a model that performs less but generalizes better, because that is a more true representation of the actual performance of the model itself. In other words, it's not overfit to your training data. So related to this idea of dimensionality is this almost mythical curse of dimensionality. And it's tempting to think that more features are better, right? But this whole dimensionality issue is more than just a problem of things like redundancy or relevancy or noisy features that are spuriously correlated with your class data. There is something called Hughes phenomenon, which is actually almost the same concept as the curse of dimensionality, where the optimal number of features in a model or the performance of the model rises as you add some features that are informative and over time actually decreases. And this is true even if the features tend to be fairly informative, that they're actually meaningful. And I will just give you my kind of intuition of why this is the case. So basically, as you add dimensions, or if you add features, you add dimensions to your data set. And if you add dimensions to your data without adding density, meaning adding samples to your data. So if you have 100 people in your data set and you go from two features to three features, as shown kind of in this little demonstration of a classifier that's trying to classify cats versus dogs, which is actually a classic example in machine learning and image processing. What happens to your estimates of the mean of each class, or not just the mean, but any moment estimators? So mean, the standard deviation, the skewness, all of these things. Um, the error bounds on those estimates grows exponentially with the dimensionality, but because the density of the point clouds decreases exponentially as you add dimensions. So basically, the difference in how much information is contributed between relevant and irrelevant features becomes small compared to the actual error bounds of your estimates. And essentially what happens is then the model cannot actually figure out where the patterns are in your data. So this is another reason why parsimony or the simplicity of the model is so important. Essentially, it's a statistical inevitability that if you add too much information, uh, you basically lose the ability to interpret that information. So I'm just going to make then, as a final note on feature spaces, a special mention of deep learning. And I probably should have mentioned earlier that we're not going to get into deep learning in this lecture because this is a much more advanced topic. I mean, I know it's not something that's extremely new anymore. It's been around for 12, 13 years, but um, it's really something that you need to arrive at after you've kind of really gotten a good handle of traditional machine learning, or uh, what I would call more traditional machine learning, because the concepts are very similar, but you need to be able to kind of build up uh, from the kinds of machine learning algorithms that we're going to be talking about today. So what deep learning actually contributes in a very fundamental way to the machine learning world is the ability to learn features in a hierarchy. So, and what I mean by that is that you can actually input the raw data, still pre-processed in some way, normalization, scaling, and all of that. And from these raw data, like images in this case, images of faces, the algorithm can build up to simple features, then more and more complex features. We're starting to get pieces or parts of faces, and then something like face templates and higher layers. So it's able to more or less autonomously figure out a hierarchy of patterns that are important for performing the classification task, in this case, face recognition. And this is where it gets its power from, essentially. So it's a very useful tool, but very difficult to use well, I would say. Um, so now we've figured out kind of how a little bit about how to work with your feature space or your input space. Let's talk a little bit more about the actual model fitting and prediction step. So this is where we talk about classification itself. Now we already talked about the idea that classification is trying to find a decision boundary between different classes or categories in your data. And of course, it's useful to think about this in two dimensions for simplicity. But you can imagine if you have well-separated data, as in this plot here, there are actually many, in fact, an infinite number of possible decision boundaries, right? And the um, uh, the interesting concept behind what's called a support vector machine, which I would say is one of the more useful and user-friendly classifiers around, is that it chooses the decision boundary that maximizes the distance between the closest points on both sides of the decision boundary, so in both classes, to the decision boundary itself. And so this is called the maximum margin principle. And basically, the intuition behind this is very simple, is if you're farthest away from both classes as possible, then once you test your model on new data, you should maximize generalizability because you have the highest probability of new data falling on the correct side of the decision boundary. Whereas you can imagine if I draw the boundary very close to the blue dots and very far away from the red squares, you will probably classify the red squares very well once you add new data points in, but misclassify quite a lot of blue dots because they would fall on the other side of the decision boundary. So this is a very useful intuition that we can use in a geometric sense. Decision trees work very differently from a lot of classifiers. In this case, a decision tree builds a type of logic tree by basically looking at features or even groups of features separately and tries to find thresholds for those features. So in this kind of survival model of a particular disease, this decision tree would try to look at first what is the first most predictive feature in the model. In this particular example, it's whether the sex of the individual is male or female. And if it's male, it's very likely that they survived, or actually not very likely that they survived. The next most important feature is the age, and then it continues down this tree. And for each feature, makes a decision about whether the likelihood that someone died or survived based on the sex, the age, and other clinical variables. So these are also very powerful, especially with clinical tables and those kinds of demographic variables. But as you can imagine, it would be very difficult to input something like a series of brain regions or brain images into a model like this, unless you were to actually calculate features that you already knew were important to the decision-making process. So you would have to really build in quite a lot of domain knowledge for these models to work really well. And finally, we have neural networks, which again, I'm not going to talk too much about. But again, like I said, these kind of build up a hierarchy of features by taking combinations of features, simpler features from earlier layers, recombining them and building up new features, and then finally passing this end layer of features into an output decision-making node. And these are very powerful, but they're also the most difficult to interpret in general because getting your information from your decision layer all the way back into your input space to understand how this model made these decisions in the first place is really not a trivial process. There are a lot of methods for attempting to do this, but none of them are really considered to be the final answer for understanding what a neural network does. So they can be very powerful, but also difficult to understand. So what I want to do is actually talk a lot more about support vector machines, because this is kind of the basis of the demo, and also because in most cases, I would say the support vector machine is kind of the default classifier that I would start with if I were to start a new project and I had a list of features already available to me. Of course, this different if you just had raw images, and maybe sometimes it's easier just to go with a deep learning method if you're comfortable enough to use it. But in general, we have something like clinical data or features that have already been calculated for us, or if we know how to calculate features from the raw data, then I would generally start with a support vector machine. They're quite powerful because of this maximum margin principle, and because of the second principle that they use, which is called the kernel trick. So the support vector machine can solve nonlinear problems as well, very flexibly, using something called this kernel trick. And basically, the idea here is that it uses this kernel function. This could be something like a Gaussian function, for example, or any kind of nonlinear function, which has to be invertible to project the data into a higher dimension. And it can project this into kind of theoretically arbitrarily high dimension until the data are kind of maximally linearly separable. So until you can find a hyperplane that maximizes the separability or the classification of these two classes while satisfying this maximum margin in the hyperplane that we talked about earlier. And then using the inverse of this kernel, project that decision boundary back into the input space, which, as you can, because this kernel function itself is nonlinear, can give you this very interesting nonlinear decision boundary. And of course, just like I talked about at the beginning, this decision boundary is perhaps not really something that we know how to mathematically define, because it might be piecewise definable or somewhat definable if we knew what the if we knew the kernel and the dimensionality of the other space. But as you get into these nonlinear functions, it becomes more and more difficult to understand what the actual decision boundary is, but we know that it works quite well. So these two principles together, this maximum margin principle and this kernel trick principle, work very well together to make this a very powerful tool. And support vector machines are still used quite ubiquitously throughout the literature. So now that we have kind of our tools in place, we're going to start to think about how do we actually build robust and valid machine learning experiments. And here we're going to get into one of the most important concepts, which is the cross-validation loop. And the basic idea of the cross-validation loop is first and foremost to get a statistically reliable representation or estimate of your classifiers or machine learning models' performance with respect to our problem. So the idea is to start with partitioning your data. So we would start by splitting up our data into training sets and test sets. The idea, of course, is that we want to, because we're fitting equations or fitting weights in our model, we want to fit them on training data and test the generalizability of the model on the test set, which has been held out, so not used for fitting at all. And this is especially important because, well, because machine learning models are so flexible, essentially, if it had access to the test data, it would just be able to memorize the classes in a sense. So if we thought back to the support vector machine, it would be able to draw the decision boundary such that it kind of perfectly or near perfectly captures the test data as well. And it would end up being a very different decision boundary than the one that you would have if it had never seen the test data. And what we're interested in is the generalizability or the ability of the model to predict new data that we haven't seen. So going back to this Alzheimer's example, how well can the machine learning model predict or diagnose Alzheimer's for a completely new patient that we haven't used to train the model? Because if it can't do that, then it's not a very useful model in any practical sense, right? So we want to be able to predict new data. So the idea then is with this partitioning is we're trying to simulate the scenario where we actually have new data, right? So when we set aside this test set, we're pretending that these data don't exist, and that later some hospital is going to give us data from new patients, and we want to see whether our model actually works. So that's the point. And therefore, we want to report our classification or our performance metrics using just the test data, because this is what matters. Just to make sure I emphasize this point enough, basically we want always to make sure that we assume the test data don't exist. Because there's always these unexpected ways for influence of the test data to creep into our model if we are using it even for pre-processing, right? If we are using our test data to calculate the mean and standard deviation of our feature space when we do our normalization steps, we've crept in information from our test data, right? We have failed to make the assumption that the test data do not exist. And that will influence ultimately the model itself at the end. So we have to be very careful about this. So when it comes to cross-validation, we start with the principle that a single test data is not guaranteed to be representative of the data itself, right? So there are things like non-stationarity or just the statistical fact that if we randomly sample from our overall corpus of training data, we might not get a subsample, so a test set, which is statistically distributed in an identical or similar enough way to the training data. So you can end up with a model that has been trained on your training data, tested on your test data, and performs better or worse than you would expect, simply because that wasn't a very representative subset of your data in the first place. So what we actually do is we repeatedly run the entire machine learning pipeline with different partitions of the data. And that allows us to get a more robust and valid estimate of model performance. There are many ways to do this. A very common way that you would see is something like what's represented here, this 5-fold or a 10-fold cross-validation loop, where you take chunks of 10 or 20% of the data, leave that out, train on the remaining 80%, test on that 20% that you left out, and then cycle through a different 20%. My preferred way of doing this in general is to actually randomly sample that 10 or 20% that you leave out, instead of taking like a consecutive 10 or 20%. And that way, and to do this with replacement, so that way you can actually go through many more folds than just 5 or 10 folds. You can repeat this 100 or 1,000 times if you need to, just so that you can really model like the distribution of your performance metrics. And what we are looking for when we're modeling this distribution itself is that we should have a good normal distribution of our of the accuracy of our model itself, or the error rate of our model itself. This is exactly what you would look for when we are testing, say, the performance of a regression model. And it is a similar concept to hypothesis testing, where like the error in our experiment should be normally distributed, right? And if it's not normally distributed, that means there is some bias in our model or in our experiment. So by kind of stochastically choosing our test set and training set and going through many more than just 5 iterations of this, we actually can start to characterize and find the kind of density estimate of our error distribution itself and make sure that it's normally distributed. So getting a little bit more advanced, and this is what has been used in the paper that was the recommended reading for this session. We can start to use something like nested cross-validation. And this is typically needed, for example, when we're fitting the parameters that are outside of the model, so the hyperparameters of the model. This could be, for example, in the support vector machine, there's a hyperparameter C that is related to how much you want to emphasize the maximization of the margin versus how much you want to prioritize the maximization of the classification accuracy on the training data. So this is a hyperparameter of the model. Once you change this hyperparameter, you're essentially saying this is a new classifier. But because in some situations you want to actually optimize this parameter itself, you would end up doing this nested cross-validation loop where you have a cross-validation loop inside a cross-validation loop where you actually vary this model parameter. And that way you are not overfitting by optimization of hyperparameters. Another example of this is when we do feature selection. We don't know a priori how many features we should be looking to use, right? So if we have a data set of 100 features, we don't know if the 5 of the features are actually the best features that capture most information, or if it's 10 features, or if it's 11 features. So we might vary this parameter, the number of features that we actually choose, and we would have to do this within a nested cross-validation. Otherwise, we essentially would be overfitting by feature selection. So we always have to be careful about this. These cross-validation loops can get arbitrarily complicated. Um, and there's both a science and a kind of art to designing these. But in general, whenever I teach this with students or lecture about this topic in general, you should be safe if you stick to the main principle, which is basically if you're fitting anything, assume the test data don't exist. So however complicated you need to get with your cross-validation loop, however many nestings you need, or however much, how many statistical methods you need to use to make sure that you get a good valid estimate of your model performance, just make sure you never forget the idea. The goal at the end of the day is that your test data do not exist. Um, they are the data that you are pretending you're going to get from some outside collaborator or some outside, not even collaborator, someone who really wants to show that your model is going to fail. And uh, they're only going to get it to you after you give them the model itself, right? And for example, there are journals in the machine learning world where you actually have to give them your model and they will test it on new data that they have and that you don't even have access to. So sometimes this is really taken very seriously. And this is just to get your paper reviewed. So yeah, try to make sure we stick to this main principle at all times. Now, let's say we did all of this properly, hopefully. How do we go about actually interpreting our results? So let's talk about metrics that we use and evaluation. So classification metrics are not always too complicated, but there are some considerations to be made. So the first consideration is whether or not we have balanced classes. And by this, I simply mean um, in a two-class classification problem, is it more or less a 50-50 split of classes? Or do we actually have a much more imbalanced set of classes? So let's say your Alzheimer's patients data set had 95% healthy controls and 5% Alzheimer's patients, and you want to diagnose Alzheimer's, you calculate the accuracy of your model, and it's 95%, and then you go to publish, and then someone asks you, well, how well does it classify specifically Alzheimer's patients? And you look into your model, and actually it just classifies everyone as a healthy control, which gives it a 95% accuracy. So you want to be careful about little things like that, of course. So of course there are metrics that you can choose which take into account the fact that your classes might be imbalanced. In the paper that's for the reading for this session, we have this weighted F1 score. That is one way to kind of capture this class imbalance in a multi-class setting, which of course takes into account, say, like sensitivity and specificity. And in general, we can like construct these most of these metrics based on looking at true positive rates, false negative rates, true negative rates. We can define things like precision, recall, accuracy, and this tends to be how we get most of these different metrics. And there are a wide variety of metrics. Of course, regression would have different metrics, clustering would have different metrics. But this is just to say that it's important to actually think about what kind of metrics we're using for a classification model. Then when we're talking about evaluation, we actually want to look at whether our model makes sense, right? And this goes back to starting to look at whether our model has just been able to use noisy features that just by chance correlate with our class models, whether in a clinical perspective that these the features that are selected actually make sense biologically. And here's where we get into the issue of explainable AI, which is remains a very big topic because we don't really have necessarily the best solutions for it yet, or at the very least, it's not a solved problem outside of linear models. So, and most of the time, linear models are not sufficient to solve the interesting problems of the world. So it's always going to be a difficult thing to try and deal with when you're working with a machine learning model. So looking at feature importance, which is how your model itself ranks the importance of different features, is one of the clearer ways of interpreting a model, because it's basically telling you which features in the input space drive performance. There are, of course, a variety of different definitions for what feature importance is. In other words, a variety of different metrics. If you used feature selection, for example, your feature selector would use a certain metric or algorithm or set of metrics to actually choose which features. So it might be a mutual information based feature selection method. So it might tell you then, well, these are the features that maximize the mutual information between themselves and the target variable or the labels. You get more complicated metrics, which involve, say, the ratio of the mutual information between features and the class labels versus the mutual information within the feature space itself. So that's like a redundancy metric. We can look at then the feature selection frequency. So across your many cross-validation runs, how often is a certain feature selected? And of course, if a feature is a good feature and a model is a good model, it should consistently select the same features, right? Or more or less consistently, at least. And this is another reason why I personally prefer to do this stochastic cross-validation, where you randomly subsample your test data with replacement and do it over many more runs so that you can actually compute these things much more reliably. Finally, if you have a model, and this is generally most interpretable, most applicable to linear models, you can look at the actual weights that are assigned to each feature. So these would be, in a linear sense, the coefficients in the linear equation that the model solves for. And of course, large coefficients mean that that feature is more useful or more relied upon to make the decision than features with low coefficients. So this is one way to look at the explainability or interpretability of your model. There are some more advanced techniques. These are not necessarily actually extremely advanced or anything. They're not all that new anymore. But in terms of something like support vector machines and the types of classifiers we're talking about, these are pretty powerful techniques that tell us a little bit more in detail about how each feature is contributing to decisions. And for example, things like SHAP and LIME can actually tell you on a sample by sample basis which features seem to be the most important and in which direction they pulled the decision towards Alzheimer's or towards a healthy control, for example. So I won't go into too much detail about how each of these work, but just to bring to your attention that there are a variety of methods that you can use that are outside of just looking at the model itself. So these are now algorithms that take your model and take your data set and try to analyze in much more detail how the decisions are being made. And of course, deep learning is a whole different topic when it comes to explainability that we won't get into. But if you're in the deep learning world, then you have a whole set of other methods for doing this. So with all that in mind, let's talk a little bit then about how machine learning is being used in brain modeling. I said in the beginning, this is like a very ripe area for research. It's still pretty new. Machine learning has been much more used in the clinical world, in taking empirical data and trying to do diagnoses and things like that, and in the brain-computer interfacing world, so neuroengineering and things like that. So this idea of using machine learning and brain modeling together is quite new, and we can do some things that are, I would say, quite interesting. So one of the first things you might think of, I think you have learned quite a bit about brain modeling so far. So you're well aware of this idea that when we have a brain model, very often we have kind of the mathematical formulation of our neural model, could be our Jensen-Ritt model or something like that. We have our empirical data that we're trying to simulate or drive simulations from. And we have this hyperparameter space, very similarly to the machine learning world, where we have hyperparameters we want to tune. In the neural modeling world, we have hyperparameters we want to tune. And traditionally, we use either like some grid search method to find the hyperparameters that maximize the fit between the output of our neural model and our empirical data, or we could use some kind of Bayesian method. There are now also machine learning and in particular deep learning methods that are based on Bayesian inference that actually more efficiently and perhaps more accurately and precisely actually allow you to find these parameters, the optimal parameters. And in particular, the simulation-based inference, SBI, is interesting in the sense that it actually provides you with a posterior distribution over the parameter space that tells us about the likelihood of our optimal parameters being in a certain space or a certain region of this grid. So it takes your neural model and empirical data as inputs. It actually runs the simulations by sampling the hyperparameter space and then uses this neural density estimator, which is basically a neural network that tries to estimate from its own sampling history the posterior distribution, so the optimal regions of the parameter space, and eventually lands or converges on a solution where it thinks, okay, your best parameter space is somewhere here. And of course, this is at the very least more efficient than doing a grid search over the entire parameter space. So I think this is very interesting. I think this is one of the clearly will continue to be one of the fruitful areas of investigation for applying machine learning to our brain models. And I think there's still quite a bit of work that can be done here, right? To understand for what models these work with, what happens if your parameter space is not continuous with respect to your fitting criteria. And there are a lot of considerations to be made here. So I think there's a lot more that can be done here. Next, like this, for the paper that we had for the recommended reading, this is like a completely different way of using machine learning with brain models and maybe also like an intuitive way to look at things. I know this is a busy slide, but in this case, what we're interested in is actually using empirical data and simulated data to do Alzheimer's classification, right? So can simulated data or simulations provide information that help us with performing diagnosis in a machine learning sense? So we can think of this as classification over joint feature spaces. So rather than one feature space, we might have more than one feature space. And there are many questions about how to combine these feature spaces or how to use them optimally together. And of course, there are considerations or questions that go even beyond what we did in this paper so far. So this paper kind of takes or puts into practice a lot of the stuff that we talked about already. It maybe is a little bit more complicated in some areas than what we talked about, but the basic principles that we talked about for this lecture are all there here. So we start with nested cross-validation, and this cross-validation loop is kind of specially designed for a small sample problem because that was our situation here. We end up running many thousands of models. That way we can get very, very robust estimates of model performance under different conditions, as well as estimates of feature importance and selection frequency and all of those things. Then we, of course, are looking at the distribution. Because we have all of these cross-validation loops in this nested hierarchy, we can look at the distributions of our model performance when we're looking just at the empirical data, which in this case of the amyloid beta and tau distributions that we get from PET scans of different patients, as well as the brain region volumes that we get from MRI, structural MRI. We can look at the performance of the model just in the simulated feature set, which in this case are simulated local field potentials. And then finally, we can look at the performance distribution when we look at combining the feature sets in different ways. In this case, the combination is just a concatenation of the feature spaces, but we can see that the simulated features seem to contribute something, or at least make it so the model can capture information that is diagnostically relevant that it was not as well able to capture in each of the feature spaces alone. And to check that how much overfitting we are risking, or whether this is just related to the fact that there are more features or something like that, we could run this entire cross-validation loop again for each of these different cases, but by randomly permuting the class labels. So this is a way to get to run a permutation test that gives you kind of a null distribution of your performance. So if we randomly shuffle the class labels on, say, each of 100 or 1,000 runs of this entire cross-validation loop, how does our model performance change, and how does our model do then? And then you can see that we can get fairly close to chance level results here. So we know that, statistically, what we're seeing is that the information being captured by this model is specific to Alzheimer's somehow, specific to the class labels, because it doesn't carry over once you randomly shuffle the class labels. And the randomly shuffling, because some iterations of the random shuffle will be very similar to the actual true distribution of class labels. You do get some cases where the accuracy is high, but we could, for example, correlate this to, we can correlate the performance of this to the correlation between the shuffled and the true class labels. So we know that there's some specificity in the model here. And then, like we talked about, we can also examine the top features. We can look at how many or which features come from which of the different feature spaces. And we can look at whether these, from a biological perspective, actually make sense. So most of these correspond to things that we can find in the literature that we know are somehow related to Alzheimer's disease. And when we have features that are not necessarily related to Alzheimer's disease, or we don't know a priori that they're related, then what we can say from a machine learning, as one of the utilities of machine learning, is that we can then point to candidate biological mechanisms and say, hey, maybe this feature about the brain is actually relevant for Alzheimer's, but it hasn't really been thoroughly studied yet. So this is one of the powerful applications of machine learning. So that kind of concludes the meat of the topic, and I wonder if maybe we can just briefly check if there are any questions first. In the meantime, I'll switch over. Okay, we have several questions. Okay, and also feel free to turn on your mics and interact in a more human level if you would like, but no pressure. So, first question, I understand that support vector machines is usually considered the default choice when it comes to type of classifiers. What are the typical scenarios where decision trees and neural networks would be the first choice? Yeah, so this is a good question, especially because there is not always a very good answer to this. I can tell you the way I think about it. So for decision trees, I would think about it in terms of, if we have very good domain knowledge about a topic, and we have a good idea of, like, these features are very well curated. We know that there is hierarchical information. For example, that there is a logic to it. So for example, in Alzheimer's disease, it could be something like, if the patient is female, then we would go down, look at different kinds of information than if the person is male. And we can think about, if the person is female and they are this age or older, and they are, say, have this BMI, et cetera, et cetera. If we understand from a clinical perspective that there is this type of hierarchical information, and our data set has the representative capacity to actually take advantage of that, a decision tree could be actually very useful. And in fact, we actually do use a type of decision tree with a support vector machine in the paper that I just showed. So the type of decision tree, which is a random forest, actually is used to do the feature selection part, to rank the features. And then we pull out the features that the decision trees thinks are the most important. And then we pass those on to the support vector machine. And so by using them together, we actually are able to maximize performance that way. So that's one way that we would, one situation where we would use a decision tree. But you always have to check again, because just because you have that kind of scenario, it doesn't mean the decision tree will be the best model. It sometimes maybe just doesn't have the power to actually find the optimal solution, even though it can find a good and interpretable and logical solution. When it comes to a neural network, so something like a traditional neural network, like a multi-layer perceptron, which is kind of this, has a single hidden layer, I really don't think it's used that much anymore. So generally when we talk about neural networks, we're talking about deep learning. So this I would use if we want to do something more like feature learning and feature discovery. In particular, I would use this if it's first of all not that important to understand exactly how the model is able to come to its decisions and to understand the actual feature space itself. And I would use a neural network or deep learning when you have this kind of rich, detailed input space, and it's very difficult to understand how to calculate features from it. And so that's why image processing was kind of the first major domain of deep learning and neural networks, because it's very, I mean, there's been a lot of work in computer vision for understanding how to take, for example, images of faces, or if we go back to neuroscience, let's say MRI scans, and try to understand what information can we calculate from these, like say brain parcellation volumes and things like that, and use that in a classifier. But like a deep learning model is much more free and basically unconstrained by our preconceptions of what information is important and what we already know how to calculate from the data. And it can kind of figure out on its own what features to calculate, right? So if we don't really know what features to calculate, or it's a very complicated problem and there's so many different kinds of features we can calculate, a neural network tends to be very important there. And especially when you get like this, a certain type of hierarchy in the information, right? Like I showed in this example of going from basically something like edge detectors to nose and eye detectors to face templates, right? That's a type of hierarchy that it would be very difficult for us to calculate and represent numerically as features, right? So in that case, something like a neural network is extremely important there, or useful there. Just very quickly go to this one. Could you please share a notebook? Yes, that is going to be the plan. I will email it out like later on to the course organizers, or figure out exactly what the method of sharing is, because I don't know exactly yet what the protocol
Kiret.
is.
Actually, we
Yes.
have our virtual course materials or other educational materials are available on our eBrains Collab, so virtual
Perfect.
education materials.
Perfect.
You can then upload your notebook.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Thanks.
So that is absolutely the plan, is to share it. And let's see. So if a trained model works well in the external validation, what is the point of internal validation then? So if you could please clarify what you mean by internal validation.
Hi, can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So firstly, because I have a background of epidemiology, so I use the terms that I learned from my epidemiology course. For instance, here, internal validation and external validation. From your slide, my guess or my understanding is the X validation is corresponding to the testing set or testing process. And the internal validation is equivalent to the validation set in your slide. So my question is, because let's say I'm now working on both process. Firstly, on the training set and then the testing set. And I just found out that my model works pretty well on the testing set. And now that kind of drove me thinking, why, or should I still care as much for the validation process anymore, or it doesn't matter anymore?
Okay, I understand what you're saying. So the point of the internal validation usually comes first, right? Before the external validation. And basically, it's because you want to save the external validation kind of for the end. Because if you start testing all sorts of different variations of your model on the external validation, there's also this issue of overfitting by model selection, right? So like what if you were say I had like 10 different models and I test them all, it's like, well, this one works best on the external data set, so that's the one that I will use. Well, now what if someone gave you a different external data set? Maybe it was actually a different model that performed best on both of them. So usually what we do is we do the internal validation first, and that is a way for us to say, this is what I think the best model is that will perform best on the external validation, right? So that we're really saving it for the end.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
No problem. So maybe a more detailed question regarding the k-fold cross-validation. This is from Julie. I hope I pronounced it correctly one of the ways. How do I know how many folds I need? Is there a general principle one can stick towards testing? So well, we can use kind of statistics to somewhat answer this. You might not actually know a priori, right? But how many folds you need essentially is related to how variable the performance of your model is. So if your model performance changes a lot fold by fold, you need more folds so that you have basically more samples to fill in your distribution. So basically, you just want enough folds so that you can get a good, a representative sample. And essentially that your distribution, which is hopefully normal, of your model performance essentially converges to something. So that's basically the best answer I can give you. You might not know a priori, actually. Sometimes it's just good to pick like a good round number like 50 or 100 or something like this. Yep.
Hello.
Yes.
Sorry, may I ask one last question?
Yes, you may.
If time permits. Yeah, I have a quick question regarding the concept of parsimony.
Yeah.
For instance, I have, say, 5 variables, and then I applied some regularized, like say, for instance, lasso or some other terms I want to use it. For instance, I just apply a lasso to my data, and then lasso retain all 5 of those variables. But then I applied maybe clinical knowledge, some subject knowledge, and I decided to just use 3 of those 5, and it turned out those 3 variables, the models with those 3 variables works equally well. So my question for you is now, what would be your next move in this scenario?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, right? Because at some level, there's a judgment call here. And that judgment call also should take into account domain knowledge and things like that, like these two variables that weren't chosen from this other method, which I think, was based on domain expertise. Um, is there some reason that they should be included in the data set at all? Because statistically, yeah, just using lasso or something like that, like it's not it's not the final answer in terms of which variable should be used. Neither is feature selection, neither is any other statistical method. And there is no kind of objective final answer. It's really just a kind of principle of modeling that we prefer simpler models over more complicated ones. But I would say from the outset that a model or a data set with just 5 variables, we would kind of already call that parsimonious because it's such a small number of variables anyway. But in general, we would tend to prefer the model with 3 variables over the model with 5 variables.
Okay, thanks. That's what I was thinking as well, but I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, so just to kind of attach something onto that is usually, like, we don't just rely on one method for doing things. We might want to test many different machine learning, or sorry, feature selection methods or feature combination methods, et cetera, et cetera. And we're kind of looking at the agreement across different methods, right? So if we have, like, I don't know, 10 different ways of at least statistically looking at feature selection, and most of the time, say, 4 variables are selected out of 5, and some of the times it's 3, some of the times it's all 5. We might start to look at, okay, if it's more often than not, say something like 3 or 4 variables are selected across all of these different methods, is it at least the case that the 5th variable that's not selected is usually the same variable? Because then we have higher confidence that this is not that useful of a variable, right? If it's randomly different, a different one of the 5 variables that's not selected across different methods, then we start to be less and less confident. So depending on how confident you are, like, it's a judgment call. So depending on how confident you are in your domain knowledge, that's like the first consideration. And then the second consideration is purely statistical or mathematical, which is how much agreement is there across methods. And if there's very low agreement across different methods, then we have low confidence in any one of those methods or in the statistical approach at all. So we might, at that case, make a judgment call to say, okay, we keep 4 or we keep all 5 variables just in case.
Okay, so my understanding is this judgment call is based on like 2-tier evidence. Tier 1 is from the domain or subject knowledge, and tier 2 is data-driven method, trying different data-driven methods and see their agreement. Is that correct?
Yes, with the caveat that the tiers can change depending on your confidence. So,
right.
So if you're very confident, if you have low confidence in your subject knowledge and high confidence in your statistical methods, or just in general low confidence in your subject knowledge, those tiers can flip, right?
Okay.
So always I would even say with statistics, not just machine learning, you have to make these kinds of judgment calls.
Okay, so I just keep trying.
Yes, yeah, and it's kind of the nature of data analysis, right? Is that it's different than pure math, because in pure math there's kind of an objective answer most of the time, and in data analysis or even in applied math, there's often not an objective answer.
That's true. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much.
Yep. And Drew asks, can you explain the importance of hyperparameters and nested cross-validation again? I don't fully understand what the hyperparameters are. No apologies necessary. So hyperparameters are basically parameters of the model. So we have 2 layers of parameters, essentially. The parameters of the model are what we fit to the data. we can call those parameters. Those are kind of like the model weights. So in a regression equation, the parameters are the beta coefficients, right? Your y equals mx plus b kind of thing. So m and b are your model parameters. The hyperparameters are things that influence the model but are kind of outside the model. So I hope I pronounced your name right. It was Wei Shang.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, awesome. She mentioned the concept of lasso, right? So this is in a regression model or a classification model, this is kind of an extra term that you can add to your optimization function that influences how many variables are actually used in the model finally, right? But it comes with a parameter, this alpha or lambda parameter, depending on which paper you read, that influences essentially how many model weights it zeroes out. So in your beta coefficients, lasso will basically set some of those coefficients to 0 if these parameters or these variables are not very useful. And this gamma parameter on the lasso function, which we would call a hyperparameter, influences how strong this regularization is. So a hyperparameter then we could say influences, say, the actual model that's used. We can think of it as different variations of the same model, right? Another way to think of it is how many input features we use, which also we were just talking about. Do we give the model 3 features, 4 features, or 5 features from our data set? So these are different versions of the model, even though we would call it the algorithm is very similar. So those kinds of considerations that are kind of, we can think of them as meta modeling considerations, we call hyperparameters. And sometimes we want to optimize those. So we're trying to simultaneously optimize the model weights or the parameters and the hyperparameters of the model, which are these meta parameters. And so these are 2 different layers of parameters that we're trying to optimize. And this is why we start to get into things like nested cross-validation, because for some set of hyperparameters or metaparameters, we then want to use cross-validation within that to find what is the best model. And then we want to vary in the outer layer of the cross-validation loop the meta or hyperparameters, and then redo the cross-validation loop on the inside to look at what is the best model. And that way we can say, okay, if we run this cross-validation loop for many different types of hyperparameter settings, what is the best model and what is the best meta model of that model? And I hope that kind of clarifies it a bit. And so you can kind of get arbitrary complex. And so this is why we end up having with like test sets within test sets within test sets. And it just gets, you have a certain limitation for how deep you can go because essentially you run out of data, right? You can't just like keep partitioning your data because then if your training set is less than half of your actual data set, then you start to, it starts to not be representative on its own. So let me just see, there's one more question. This maybe is the last question. I mean, I'm personally totally fine with people asking more and more questions because the code is fairly self-explanatory. But if this is the last question, we'll jump into the code. So Shang mentioned about lasso. Could we utilize LDA, so linear discriminant analysis, to normalize the data and shrink the number of variables and then apply a secondary method, then analyze the normalized data? The answer is yes. I actually previously had a slide that mentioned LDA and then took it out for simplicity. So I almost answered your question before you asked it. And it would have been, I mentioned, for example, using PCA over here for feature combination, and LDA in the supervised case, like PCA you can do unsupervised, and LDA you would do supervised to also take kind of feature combinations and shrink kind of the dimensionality of the space, and then use a second method to actually do the classification or the regression analysis after that. Yep, it's exactly correct. And sometimes this is actually done in practice. So, continue to ask questions as you wish. In the meantime, I'll just move on to code in case no one has questions. And yes, please feel free to unmute yourself in case you want to ask questions as well. And I'll just take a quick sip of water first. So, I hope everyone can see my screen all right. It might be a little bit small to read, but I'll kind of go through it with you anyways. So basically, I wanted to give a demo or give you some code that at least kind of puts into practice all of the stuff that we talked about, or most of the stuff that we talked about. So we'll have a pipeline where we will generate some random data that is classifiable, and we'll make some use of pre-processing, feature selection, cross-validation, and then analyze the results. So I already ran this, so I'm not going to run it again necessarily, but this uses scikit-learn in Python. I think many people probably are familiar with it, but if you're not, I think it's a very nice package for doing basic machine learning work. You don't do deep learning with scikit-learn. You'd use TensorFlow or PyTorch or something for that, but for everything else, I use scikit-learn very regularly, so I really like it. It has this function called make classification, and this is just to make kind of like a toy data set with certain kinds of parameters or certain properties that you would like. And I would encourage you, or those of you who are interested in machine learning and using it, to play around with this. So you can play around with the number of samples in your data set, the number of features that actually are informative. So the rest of them are going to be noisy or not correlated to the labels. The number of features that are redundant. So amongst the informative features, some of them might carry actually the same information. The number of repeated features, so some of them might be actually the same, so not just highly correlated. You can play around with the number of classes, and an interesting parameter is the number of clusters per class. So this really complicates the machine learning problem, and I didn't really talk about this, but basically, in a very simple case, we think about classification as having these like two clusters of, let's see if I can get my hands in here, two clusters of data or point clouds, and we want to draw a line between them. But each class might actually contain multiple clusters, so subclasses in a sense, right? Just like for any disease like schizophrenia or Alzheimer's, we may actually in fact have subclasses of Alzheimer's disease. And that might actually complicate the classification problem quite a bit. So healthy controls might be something like one really big class, and Alzheimer's might be a lot of like different subclasses that are outside of that or overlapping with that. Healthy controls are probably also not a single class, right? They might also represent many different subclasses. The input of make classification can all be considered as hyperparameters. Not quite, because these are parameters of the data set itself, whereas hyperparameters are properties of the model itself or the algorithm. So another way to think about this, which maybe makes it a little bit more intuitive, is we can think of the model in a machine learning context as, say, the solution that the support vector machine arrives at. And the support vector machine is the algorithm. And the hyperparameters are like the tweaks on the support vector machine algorithm itself that influences the model or the solution that it arrives at the end of the day. I hope that also helps to make it more intuitive. I know it's actually by its nature not necessarily an intuitive concept, but please let me know if that helped to answer the question. I will see if I can show you then a little bit more what the hyperparameters are a little bit later. But rather than these being hyperparameters, these are properties of the data set itself. And finally, we can look at class separation. So how well separable are these classes? So you can play with, say, taking just 2 features or 3 features and plotting those in 2 or 3D space so that you can look at kind of the clustering and the point clouds themselves and kind of get an intuitive, like geometric understanding of what's happening here. So this is just generating the data. So we can see the number of samples, 1,000 samples, 100 features, and the classes are almost perfectly balanced. You can also change the class balance here. So another interesting thing to look at. Now, right after that, what I wanted to emphasize is even though machine learning tends to be thought of as this black box thing, data science itself shouldn't exactly be black box. We should always take the time to actually look at our feature space, look at our data itself, make some plots, look for missing data, look for, say, problematic distributions or variables that clearly are not informative because, say, maybe they all contain the same value for all samples, or almost all of them contain the same value, or there's too much missing data. Some might be exponentially distributed, some might be normally distributed. There's all these things that you need to look at that if you just throw your data into a machine learning model and it doesn't work very well, or it works too well, and you never looked at your data, you might not realize that it's because you need to take some special care in terms of how you actually pre-process and handle your data in the first place. So I just gave one example of a type of plot that I like to use sometimes. This is called like a joint plot in Seaborn. So we can look at the distributions. This is looking at pairs of features in our data. And with this, we can basically look at, well, which ones seem like they carry some classifiable information. So orange and blue are different classes. We can look at the distributions of each feature on different dimensions, or each class on different features. And with these pair plots, we can start to look at that there might be feature interactions that we want to look at. So we can see that here, this feature on the x-axis and this feature on the y-axis by themselves are has some minor information about the classes. So if we were just to do a classifier on one feature, we would get a little bit better than chance accuracy. But if we look at the point cloud, we can start to see that the orange dots tend a little bit more towards the bottom left corner, and the blue dots more towards the top right. So we can think about how our classifier, by using both of these features together, we would draw kind of a diagonal decision boundary here. So we start to get a look at how features can interact. So a feature itself alone might not be that informative, but in combination with other features, we can start to build up more and more information. So this also can give you hints about whether univariate versus multivariate feature selection is important, or whether feature combination versus univariate feature selection is important. So these are all interesting considerations. And similarly here, we have, say, this feature is actually alone decently informative, whereas the feature on the y-axis is not all that informative, but kind of in combination, it looks like it's even more informative. So it's interesting to start to like look around at your data. You don't want to overinterpret this stuff, and you don't want to start using this for feature selection by visually looking at features and saying, well, I'm going to pick this one and this one, especially if you're looking at the whole data set, because you should let the model figure it out on its own, especially in the context of partitioning your training set and your test set. So just an example of taking a look at your data, like always remember that we're also, if you're doing machine learning, you're also a data scientist. So the data is the important thing. We can't just plug it in and not really think about it. And here is a classification pipeline and a cross-validation loop. Here it's just an example of how to actually write a cross-validation loop. scikit-learn actually gives you kind of these like pipeline objects that take care of a lot of this stuff for you. But I wrote it a little bit more explicitly just so that we can actually, so that you can actually see what's happening. And in particular that you can see that for the pre-processing, which I'm just doing standard scaling, which is a Gaussian scaler, that I'm fitting it on the training data and then using the fit scaler on the training data on the test data. So this is, for example, a little step. It may not be hugely influential, but it's a little step that a lot of people don't really take care of, which is that even though all I'm doing is calculating the mean and standard deviation to use for scaling my data, I'm still doing it in the context of separating the training data and the test data. And so this is just an example of a very, very basic example of running a classifier, a support vector machine, and then computing some metrics about it, about the performance. Now, here's the first case where we actually have some, at least a single hyperparameter, which is the kernel. If you recall, I mentioned that I talked about this kernel trick in support vector machines. In this case, we're just fitting a linear model. But say you wanted to check the performance difference between a linear model and a nonlinear model. So you could run this model, which is linear, and then run another model, which is nonlinear. Now that becomes a hyperparameter because you're varying properties of the algorithm, which influences the model or the solution that you arrive at the end. So this is kind of a meta parameter, if we want to call it that. Here I'm not varying it, I'm just doing it in one loop. And then finally we save the scores that we had, so accuracy, precision, recall, the F1 score. And now here's an example where I just add some feature selection. All it is just adding another step into the process. And in this case as well, I just chose 20 features because I set up my data set to use 20 features. And this is just to show the kind of influence of feature selection when you have a lot of features. I did not write a nested cross-validation loop because it gets more and more complicated, but you can read from the paper exactly like that flow diagram of how that nested cross-validation loop works and try to write one yourself, which I think is actually a good exercise if you are interested in learning how to do this stuff. So we do much the same thing. It's mostly the same pipeline, except now with feature selection. And now in addition to storing, say, the performance and the coefficients of the model, we are also storing the feature selection scores, which in this case are the p-values. So this feature selection uses the F distribution, so essentially ANOVA, an ANOVA model, to pick features. And so the features with, of course, the lowest p-values in your ANOVA model are the ones that are the best separators of your classes. So I'm just taking the negative log of the p-values, so that the features with the most importance are ranked higher. And then we can look at, say, your distribution of your scores, accuracy, precision, recall, and the F1 score. This compares the scores with feature selection, scores without feature selection. You can see with feature selection, you get a little bit of a boost in accuracy. This is a fairly easy classification problem, so you don't get something too crazy. But you can play around with the data generation and see kind of how things get influenced and how these start to change and move around. And then finally, we can look at feature importance across the whole model, across both models. And finally, that feature selector importance. So very kind of basic entry-level classification pipeline with some feature importance, with some evaluation. Often in like a kind of typical machine learning paper, these are the kinds of plots you would see anyways. So this, I would say, would be like a good start. This is kind of what we would build up to in like an intro to machine learning course. So you got basically a 2-hour crash course in all of that. So really no worries if like not everything makes perfect sense or is completely intuitive. If you're especially completely new to machine learning and maybe don't come from like a math and stats background especially, because normally you wouldn't learn all of this in a single lecture. So no worries, but feel free to contact me for questions and things like that down the line. And I will just go back to this slide in case you want to copy down my email address, or I'm sure that you will have it in your course notes and things like that. So I think that gives us 10 minutes before the end time of the session, right? I would say that's good timing. Any more questions and things like that? For that last question about hyperparameters, was I able to help a little bit with that, or is it still just as confusing as it was before? Like,
Wait, do you mean my question or Sabrina's question?
Sabrina's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you can answer the question too. But
You did clear mine out, so thank you.
okay.
Okay, it's a little bit clearer for me. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Okay, thanks. Thanks,
Anybody
Kiret.
else?